He had expected the studio to be quiet, almost sterile, but the moment he stepped inside, it felt alive. Sunlight poured through tall windows, bouncing off canvases, brushes, and jars of paint. And then there was her, 40 years old, American Caucasian, with long black hair that shimmered in the warm morning light. Her skin was lightly tanned, dotted with subtle freckles, her dark brown eyes deep and knowing, framed by laugh lines that only added to her allure. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind that made everything around her feel intentional, graceful, and impossible to ignore. She glanced up from her palette as he entered, her gaze assessing yet playful, as if she had been waiting just for him. The hint of a smile at the corner of her lips sent a strange, sudden warmth through him. "Welcome," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying a subtle musicality that seemed to echo in the sunlit room. It wasn't just a greeting. It was an invitation, a challenge, a gentle pull toward something unfamiliar yet thrilling. The studio smelled faintly of oil paint mixed with the warm aroma of her presence, something subtle but distinct, like vanilla and sun-warmed wood. As he moved closer to the blank canvas, she stepped in, adjusting the angle of the stool beneath him with a light touch. Her fingers brushed his arm, and he felt a spark, brief, fleeting, but enough to make his pulse quicken. "Relax," she murmured, her hand resting for a heartbeat on his shoulder, grounding him. Her warmth lingered, like sunlight trapped in skin, and he realized that his focus on the art was slipping. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, each small gesture magnified in the bright, quiet studio. She circled him, examining the blank canvas before him, her presence both comforting and slightly unnerving. He noticed every detail, the way her long black hair fell over her shoulder, the subtle curves of her figure, the faint freckles along her cheekbones catching the light. Her eyes, dark and warm, flicked toward him intermittently, and in those moments, he felt a tension that had nothing to do with the paint in front of him. "You're a blank canvas," she said softly, almost as if confessing a secret. "Let me show you how to breathe life into it." The words were about art, but the way she spoke them hinted at something more, something personal. He tried to steady himself, to focus on posture, on brush strokes, but the sensation of her proximity, the slight lean when she adjusted his arm, the warm light catching her smile lines, the quiet hum of her attention, kept drawing him into her orbit. Each glance, each fleeting touch, built a subtle tension between them, a delicate, unspoken understanding that neither had to voice aloud. By the time the first session ended, the blank canvas wasn't the only thing transformed. Something intimate had begun to take shape, an unspoken bond forged in light, brushstrokes, and the quiet electricity of curiosity and mutual awareness. A slow, simmering connection, tender yet charged, had been painted in the spaces between words, glances, and gestures. The following session felt different from the first. The sunlight still poured through the tall windows, but now it seemed to highlight not just the canvases around them, but the subtle tension that had started to weave itself between them. He arrived slightly earlier this time, hoping to steady his nerves, but the moment he stepped into the bright studio, her presence wrapped around him like a warm, familiar breeze. She was already there, 40 years old, American Caucasian, her long black hair tied loosely with a ribbon that allowed soft strands to frame her face. Her lightly tanned skin glowed under the morning light, subtle freckles catching the brightness, and her curvy figure moved gracefully as she prepared the paints. The soft scratch of her brush against the palette made him pause. The sound was almost intimate, like a rhythm meant only for him. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, low, and smooth, carrying a teasing undertone that made his pulse quicken. Her dark brown eyes studied him for a moment longer than necessary, a slight smile brushing her lips. It wasn't just a greeting. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had started to form, a silent promise that the previous session wasn't a fluke. He sat, watching her move around the studio, adjusting brushes, adding color to the palette, the subtle curves of her body illuminated by the bright, sunlit space. Her fingers brushed his arm again when she handed him a brush, and he felt a warmth that lingered long after she had stepped away. Each movement, each glance, was deliberate yet seemingly casual, a choreography of subtle intimacy that drew him in without words. "Let's start with something simple," she said, stepping closer to guide his hand on the brush. The warmth of her hand against his, the slight pressure as she adjusted his angle, sent a flutter through him he couldn't control. Her long black hair fell forward slightly, brushing the side of her face, catching the sunlight in a way that made every freckle and line feel precious and real. He tried to focus on the colors, the strokes, the art itself, but her presence made concentration difficult. There was something about the way she leaned in, her eyes soft yet attentive, dark brown gaze fixed on the canvas and occasionally flicking toward him, that created a magnetic pull. Her touch was fleeting, never lingering inappropriately, but each contact seemed to carry a quiet promise, a subtle encouragement to trust, to feel, to notice. They worked together in a rhythm that was almost wordless. She would guide, he would follow, and in the spaces between instructions, glances lingered a little too long, smiles softened, and a subtle tension hummed through the studio. The blank canvas began to take shape under their combined effort, but even more, the invisible lines between them began to shift. By the end of the session, the art was secondary. What remained was the quiet awareness of each other's presence, a growing curiosity, and a delicate intimacy that neither wanted to rush but both felt deeply. A brushstroke here, a lingering glance there, and the connection was no longer just about art. It had become about them. By the third session, the studio had started to feel less like a neutral space and more like a world shared between them. Sunlight spilled across the room, bouncing off half-finished canvases and jars of paint, but it was her presence that dominated the space. She was 40 years old, American Latina this time, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, slightly tousled from earlier adjustments. Her lightly tanned skin glimmered in the warm morning light, subtle freckles across her cheeks, and the faintest smile lines at the corners of her eyes, giving her an approachable, yet quietly magnetic presence. He noticed the way she moved, deliberate, graceful, like she was fully aware of every gesture and its effect on him. She wore a flowing cream blouse and a beige skirt that moved softly as she walked. Her dark brown eyes, deep and attentive, flicked toward him with a mixture of curiosity and gentle amusement. The brush she held never seemed to be just a tool. It was an extension of herself, her artistry intertwined with an almost imperceptible intimacy that made him acutely aware of the distance, or lack thereof, between them. "Try letting the brush flow naturally," she said, her voice soft, melodic, carrying that subtle undertone that made him sit straighter in his seat without realizing why. She leaned in to adjust his hand, her fingers grazing his palm in a fleeting touch. The warmth from her skin lingered far longer than the contact, and he could feel the tiniest spark of tension that made his heart beat faster than it should. The studio smelled faintly of oil paint and sunlight, with the ever-present hint of her perfume, a delicate, floral scent that seemed to settle into the corners of his awareness. He tried to focus on the canvas, on the way the colors blended under his brush, but it was impossible to ignore her. Her eyes occasionally drifted toward him, lingering with a quiet attentiveness, and he found himself caught between wanting to look away and wanting to hold her gaze just a second longer. At one point, she stepped closer to examine his strokes, her hand brushing against his forearm as she pointed out a subtle adjustment. Her touch was light, professional, yet somehow charged, a silent communication that went far beyond words. He felt the gentle brush of her hair against his arm as she leaned in, and for a moment, the entire studio seemed to fade around them. There was no one else, no noise, no distractions, just the two of them, the blank canvas slowly filling with color, and the unspoken tension that had begun to grow between them. When she finally stepped back, he realized he had been holding his breath. She smiled softly, almost as if acknowledging the awareness that had been building between them over these sessions. There was a tenderness in her expression, a quiet invitation to see more, to feel more, to notice not just the art, but the space they were beginning to inhabit together. By the end of the session, the canvas bore the marks of their collaboration, but it was the invisible lines, the small touches, the lingering glances, the subtle rhythms of proximity that left the most lasting impression. Something delicate and unspoken had begun to emerge, a connection that was emotional, intimate, and thrilling in its restraint. Each brushstroke had not only shaped the painting, but had quietly shaped the bond between them, a bond neither was willing to rush, yet both could no longer ignore. By the fourth session, the studio had begun to feel like a private world carved out just for them. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the scattered paints, brushes, and half-finished canvases, but it was her presence that dominated his attention. She was 40 years old, American Caucasian, her long black hair flowing freely over her shoulders. Her lightly tanned skin glowed in the bright morning light, subtle freckles dusting her cheeks, and soft smile lines framed her dark brown eyes, giving her a warmth that was both approachable and quietly magnetic. She moved with a confidence that made even the simplest gestures, reaching for a brush, leaning over the palette, feel intimate and deliberate. "Let's explore shading today," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying that same playful undertone he had started to crave. She stepped closer, guiding his hand over the brush with a gentle touch. Her fingers brushed his, the contact fleeting yet enough to leave a spark lingering on his skin. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but he felt it immediately, a tiny pulse of electricity that set his heart racing. As he tried to focus on the canvas, he couldn't help but notice the details that seemed to capture his gaze without intention. The curve of her neck when she leaned in, the slight arch of her eyebrows as she assessed his strokes, the way sunlight caught the strands of her long black hair and made them shimmer. Every small movement carried a weight, an unspoken invitation to notice, to engage, to linger. She stepped back to examine his work and smiled softly, a knowing tilt of her lips that seemed to acknowledge the awareness building between them. "You're improving," she murmured, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The warmth of her fingers so close to his arm made him acutely aware of the growing tension, the intimacy that had begun to weave itself into their sessions. The studio smelled faintly of paint and sunlight, but beneath there was a subtler presence, her perfume, a delicate floral note that seemed to settle in the air around him. He found himself taking in more than just her artistry. The faint freckles along her cheeks, the gentle sway of her figure as she moved, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her every gesture. For a moment, she leaned in to adjust his brushstroke, and the proximity was almost overwhelming. He felt the brush of her arm against his, the subtle warmth of her hand, and the faint scent of her hair. The contact was fleeting, professional in intention, yet charged with a quiet intimacy neither of them could fully name. When she finally stepped back, the bright studio seemed to hum with the unspoken understanding between them. Their eyes met, and in that glance, there was an acknowledgement of the tension, the curiosity, and the connection that had been slowly forming over the previous sessions. It was no longer just about art. By the end of the session, the blank canvas had evolved, but so had the invisible lines between them. Each brushstroke, each fleeting touch, each lingering look had begun to shape a bond that was emotional, subtle, and deeply charged, a connection neither was willing to rush, yet both were beginning to crave. The subtle shift in the air was unmistakable. Something tender, intimate, and quietly electric had begun to take hold by the fifth session. The studio had become a place of unspoken connection. The sunlight poured in through the tall windows, reflecting off scattered paints and half-finished canvases, but it was her presence that held the room's attention. She was 40 years old, American Latina, her long black hair cascading down her back, catching the light in soft, natural highlights. Her lightly tanned skin glowed, freckles visible on her cheeks, and her dark brown eyes were warm, expressive, and subtly mischievous. Her curves were graceful and unassuming, each movement carrying a quiet confidence that drew his gaze in ways he didn't expect. As he positioned himself in front of the blank canvas, she stepped closer, adjusting his posture with a gentle, professional touch. Her hand brushed his arm briefly, and he felt a flutter he could neither ignore nor fully understand. "Try letting your movements be more fluid," she suggested, her voice soft and melodic, carrying that same teasing undertone that always made his chest tighten. He tried to concentrate on the brush, the paint, the strokes, but it was impossible. Every glance she cast in his direction, every subtle lean toward him, pulled him in. Her presence was magnetic, quietly commanding attention without even trying. He noticed the way sunlight bounced off her long black hair, the faint smile lines that gave her face depth and warmth, and the curve of her lips when she concentrated. Each detail made him more aware of her, not just as an artist, but as a woman whose attention seemed to linger on him. At one point, she stepped closer to inspect his work. Her hand brushed against his forearm as she pointed out a subtle adjustment, and the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than necessary. The faint floral scent of her perfume mixed with the smell of paint, embedding itself in the room and in his mind. His pulse quickened, yet there was an ease in her manner, a gentle reassurance that made the tension feel both safe and thrilling. For a few minutes, they worked almost silently. Their focus on the canvas was punctuated by soft guidance and fleeting touches. Her hand would graze his briefly, or her elbow would come near his as she leaned in. Every contact was fleeting, professional in intent, yet the undercurrent of intimacy was undeniable. He realized he was acutely aware of her every movement, every subtle shift in posture or expression. When she finally stepped back, she smiled at him softly, her dark brown eyes holding a quiet warmth. "You're learning," she said, her tone gentle but knowing. That single glance, that subtle smile, communicated more than words could: acknowledgement, encouragement, and a shared understanding of a growing, delicate bond. By the end of the session, the canvas had begun to take on color and form, but it was the invisible strokes between them that left the deepest impression. Each fleeting touch, lingering glance, and shared silence had woven a tapestry of connection, intimacy, and subtle desire. It was no longer just about art. It was about noticing, feeling, and understanding each other. A quiet intimacy had taken root, one that promised slow-burning passion without haste, and a connection neither wanted to rush, yet both found impossible to ignore. By the sixth session, the studio no longer felt like a neutral workspace. It had become a quiet stage for an unspoken connection that had been building over weeks. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bright and warm, illuminating canvases, brushes, and jars of paint. Yet the light seemed drawn to her presence. 40 years old, American Caucasian, long black hair flowing freely, lightly tanned skin glowing in the bright morning sun. Her subtle freckles and soft laugh lines only enhanced her mature beauty, while her dark brown eyes held a depth that made him feel both seen and understood. Her curvy, graceful figure moved fluidly around the studio, every step deliberate, every gesture carrying a quiet authority tempered with warmth. "Focus on the emotion behind the strokes," she suggested softly, her voice low, melodic, and imbued with that teasing undertone he had come to anticipate. She stepped closer, brushing his arm lightly as she adjusted his hand on the brush. That single touch sent a warmth coursing through him, subtle yet undeniable. He felt his pulse quicken, but there was no fear, only a thrilling awareness of the space they were creating together, both physically and emotionally. As he tried to concentrate on the canvas, he couldn't ignore the small, intimate details. The way sunlight caught the strands of her long black hair, the slight arch of her eyebrows as she examined his strokes, and the curve of her lips when she smiled. Each movement, each subtle glance, was like a brushstroke in itself, painting a silent narrative of tension, curiosity, and unspoken desire. At one point, she leaned in closer to examine his work. The proximity was palpable. He could feel the warmth of her body, catch the faint scent of her perfume, and notice the soft rhythm of her breathing. Her hand brushed his forearm once again, a fleeting gesture loaded with meaning. He realized that every time she moved near him, a quiet crescendo built within him, a mix of anticipation and fascination that made the act of painting feel secondary. She paused, her dark brown eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, there was no canvas, no brushes, only the two of them. The intensity in her gaze was both comforting and electrifying, conveying understanding, encouragement, and a subtle acknowledgement of the tension that had quietly developed between them. He felt seen in a way he hadn't expected, as if each brushstroke and gesture had been creating not just art, but an invisible thread linking them. The session drew to a close, and she stepped back, smiling softly, a gentle warmth radiating from her presence. "You're doing beautifully," she said, her voice carrying the weight of sincerity and subtle affection. He could only nod, acutely aware of the lingering connection, the unspoken bond that had grown steadily over the weeks. By the end, the canvas was vibrant and full of life, but the invisible masterpiece had been painted in their shared glances, fleeting touches, and the quiet rhythm of proximity. The emotional crescendo had reached a peak, a delicate tension that neither could deny, yet both understood must be savored slowly. Their connection was no longer just about art. It was about recognition, intimacy, and electric anticipation of what might come next. The final session felt different, lighter, yet charged with a depth of emotion that had been quietly building over the weeks. The studio was bathed in bright morning sunlight, casting a golden glow across the canvases and paint jars. But the light seemed drawn to her presence. 40 years old, American Latina, long black hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin glowing, subtle freckles and soft laugh lines giving her a graceful, approachable beauty. Her dark brown eyes held both warmth and quiet satisfaction, a reflection of the connection that had grown between them. As he entered, she looked up and smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that immediately made his chest tighten. She was wearing a flowing pastel blouse and beige skirt, casual yet elegant, her curvy figure moving with effortless grace. There was a gentleness in her demeanor, an ease in her posture, but her presence was magnetic, drawing him in without a single word. "Today, let's bring your vision to life," she said softly, her voice warm and low. She stepped closer to guide his hand over the brush, her fingers brushing his palm lightly. The touch was fleeting, but the warmth lingered, echoing the subtle intimacy of their past sessions. It was a professional gesture, yet layered with the quiet understanding they had cultivated, an acknowledgement of the emotional thread connecting them. He noticed the familiar details with a new awareness. The way sunlight caught her long black hair, highlighting soft strands around her face, the slight arch of her eyebrows as she studied his work, the curve of her lips when she smiled encouragingly. Her presence was comforting and thrilling all at once, a balance of maturity and approachable warmth that made him feel seen, valued, and quietly desired. As they worked side by side, their movements became almost choreographed, her guidance his effort, a subtle rhythm that didn't require words. Occasionally, their hands brushed, or their shoulders came close as they leaned over the canvas. Each contact was fleeting, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. The air between them was charged, yet safe, and each lingering glance reinforced the connection that had been carefully nurtured over time. When the final brushstroke was laid, she stepped back and studied the completed canvas. The room was silent except for the soft hum of sunlight on the wooden floor. She turned toward him, her dark brown eyes locking with his, and smiled. There was pride in her expression, but also something more, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. "You've done beautifully," she murmured, her voice carrying warmth and sincerity. He felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, an understanding that what had formed between them was rare and meaningful, an intimacy rooted in mutual respect, subtle desire, and emotional honesty. In that moment, the studio felt like a cocoon, a space where two people had discovered each other not through grand gestures, but through quiet touches, shared glances, and the slow unfolding of trust. The connection had been built stroke by stroke, glance by glance, and now it stood complete, a masterpiece in its own right. As the sunlight continued to bathe the room, he realized that while the canvas had been finished, the bond they shared was ongoing. A quiet resolution had been reached, one that left them both deeply connected, emotionally fulfilled, and aware that this slow, deliberate journey had created something lasting, tender, and profoundly human.